I'm off to another wedding today at Elora Mill, very excited for that. But first I'm gonna teach you guys how I shoot manual in the fastest, most efficient way possible. So the reason to shoot manual theoretically in the past has kind of been to have full control over any situation. While that is fine and great, I think that the strength of shooting manual actually comes into speeding up your post-production so that when you are out taking pictures in a specific lighting setting, that you're taking all of those pictures in the same setting, so when you get home, you can edit one and batch it across the board, which is incredible for family photos, during the ceremony, during getting ready, just really every part of the day. And by shooting everything in manual, a typical like 3,000 image day that I usually shoot, to call that down to about 600, 700 images and put it through Lightroom and edit everything, usually takes me about 2 hours, 15, 20 minutes, somewhere in that ballpark. That said, I do actually outsource everything because it's way easier for me to just get home from the wedding that night, build a smart preview catalog, send it off, and then by Tuesday, Wednesday, usually the next week, all of those images are just edited for me and I don't have to think about it. Let's get into the actual instructional elements of this video. So I am usually shooting wide open or near wide open. I would say that if I'm shooting anything, this is the 24mm f1.4. If I'm shooting anything more than like f2 in a traditional day, it's very strange. f2.8 usually for family photos, and f4, f5.6 if they start like layering themselves and they really do create a huge depth of field that I need to get. But for the most part, all of my lenses I'm shooting wide open or near wide open. So I just kind of pick an f-stop, and today I'm probably gonna shoot this at f1.6 because I really like that background separation, especially with a wide angle lens. So I have that piece fully decided. And basically what manual is just full manual settings of everything, if you're unfamiliar. Sorry, that should have been in the beginning. So my aperture is pretty much consistent throughout the entire day, so I don't have to worry too much about that. The other thing that is consistent for me is my shade white balance as well. If I am outside right now, I will be shooting shade. If I go into a room with any sort of natural light, I'm usually on shade white balance. I err in the direction of keeping things a little bit warmer rather than cooler. So that's another thing that's pretty much set up for the entire day. I will change when we get into the reception. If it's in incandescent lighting or fluorescent lighting, I'll find a white balance that works for that, or the ceremony if we're in a different indoor space for that. But I would say for 80% of every wedding day, I'm usually shooting shade white balance. I think that the easiest way to actually find a good white balance is to first take off the lens cap, which is the most important part about photography, and to go into your white balance here and just be in live view and just cycle through what kind of works the best rather than just like taking test frames. Something like this is a lot faster. And then if you do want absolute full control, you can get into the Kelvin numbers here, and you can actually scroll with front wheel to kind of go through and actually create a perfectly custom white balance for the scene. You can also do things like play with the tint, the magenta, green balance, but I usually don't do that too much in camera because I find that these profiles on Nikon are pretty good out of the box. So now when I walk into the room, I have 2 of my 4 possible manual settings just locked down, that I know my f-stop's gonna be pretty much wide open, and I know that my white balance is pretty much locked unless I'm getting into a weird situation, which you can figure out pretty quickly. So that means that there are only 2 other variables to deal with, and that is shutter speed and ISO. The first thing that I do is I put my ISO as low as it can possibly go. In this case, it is 1.0, which I think is ISO 64. And at that point, I bring my shutter speed down to about 100 if I'm indoors, maybe a little bit higher if I'm outside. And then I have a quick look at my meter and I see if I am way off or if I'm pretty close to kind of the 0 line. I don't really rely specifically on my meter all day to make sure that I'm kind of zeroing that out on every single shot. I use it as kind of a frame of reference, a guideline that I know that if there's a lot of sky in a shot and it's set to matrix metering, that it's going to give me a much different reading if I'm just trying to expose for skin tones. There are ways to make that easier, like switching to spot metering so you get a more accurate reading, but I find that after you've been doing this for about a year or 2, that you really don't need a whole lot of guidance, and you pretty much won't even look at your meter for most of the day. So at this point, I usually take a test frame just to see that I'm at least in the ballpark. It's called chimping whenever you're taking pictures looking. But I would say that if your meter is pretty close, you know within like maybe plus or minus like 2 little finger movements here which direction to go, and at that point you're good to go. And I do the exact same thing every situation that I find myself in. If I am walking outside, I'm just bringing the shutter speed up, and shutter speed is probably the thing that I'm dealing the most with. Once the day starts to get a little bit darker, I bring my ISO up to whatever it needs to be to keep my shutter speed at around 100, 125, somewhere in that ballpark. I know the rule is officially to shoot whatever focal length you're using, so this is a 24, so I should be shooting at least like 1/25 of a second. But unfortunately, I am photographing people that are moving, so I like to stay around 125, 100 at the very least. But obviously go a lot higher if you're outside and there's lots of good light. So these are my thoughts on manual. It's not nearly as scary as everybody tells you that it is, and basically I'm just using my shutter speed all day to keep the mirror kind of where it's at. If I have to go lower than 100th of a second, at that point I'm just putting a little bit more ISO in to be able to keep my shutter speed at and around what it should be. Those are my thoughts. It's also my birthday, so I'm going to go and photograph this wedding, and I will see you tomorrow.